Okay, today I get a chance to have a chat with an old friend. His name's Wes Milholen, and I knew him back in the day when he was just getting started with his business called Grayscale. We were both located in the Boulder area at the time. Now we both are in separate locales, but it was kind of cool because I got to know him as he was developing some of his early products. He actually spent time on my back patio eating a salad, so it's great to get a chance now to kind of have another conversation. So with that, I'm going to kick right into it. Hey Wes, how's it going?
Hey, it's going good. Thanks for the intro.
Yeah, well,
Nice flashback to those nice Colorado summer days.
yeah, I'll tell you that's the
And
one
your basement
thing.
studio with
Yeah,
when you
my
had the big
base.
5U system.
I know. I kind of miss that sometimes,
That's
but
probably a casualty of moving. You're like, I can't take this huge thing with me anymore.
well, and I'm in a little bit smaller of a house too, and so it would end up becoming a significant occupant of the home, so we can't have that.
Yeah, it turns into a piece of furniture. It explains
Yeah,
a lot about why Eurorack is the kind of the winner of the market.
it
It
really
just fits
does. Yeah,
into your airline carry-on.
yeah, exactly. I would need my own airline to deal with the 5U system, sadly.
Moog Airlines.
That's right. They have overhead compartments like the
Yeah,
size of
you can
a
picture the
5B,
planes with
right?
like the O clef logo on the tail. They should get into that after they start making 16 voice polyphons.
Dude, I'm telling you, they're well on their way, right? So, for people who aren't familiar with your work, why don't we have you just give us a quick discussion about all the different things you do? Because you actually have a lot of stuff that you juggle. So, if you could give people just kind of a quick overview of what the totality of your work is.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I have a lot going on. I typically always have. I like to be sort of a multidisciplinary person and just having a curiosity about how it all fits together and also have a hard time saying no to interesting work. So what I'm working on now as my primary focus is making Eurorack models under the name Grayscale. I've also recently started making Buchla format models under the name 1979. And also, I'm a big contributor to VCV Rack, the open source modular software, as a designer, not as a developer.
Right. And each one of those is pretty amazing. Let's start off talking a little bit about the Eurorack system. That you started off with Eurorack by doing replacement faceplates, and this is when you and I first met. It was
Hmm.
when Snazzy Effects first came out with the Artcore module. I had one. You were hoping to put a replacement faceplate for that, and he came over so you could kind of get the dimensions on it and stuff like that. That's when we first met. But that really kind of established your place in the Eurorack market, right?
Yeah, and I started, again, being very curious about everything. I was actually kind of a multi modular platformer at that time. I had a 5U MOTM system as well. I
Hmm.
had a small 200E Buchla system and had a few, rows of Eurorack. And the MOTM system obviously is very aesthetically consistent. Paul used a very specific grid, and have you done several talks with Paul, so you know about
Right,
Paul.
right.
The Buchla 200E again. I think the vintage Buchla stuff is probably some of the best looking modular gear out there. I think Don is mostly appreciated as a circuit designer, but I think he actually came at it more as an interface designer.
Hmm.
And we can talk about that more later. But I also had some Eurorack stuff, and compared to the other two formats that I had, the Eurorack was like it was like a kitchen cabinet full of different colored cereal boxes. And I told
Right.
myself, if I'm going to start using this, I have to really dive into the aesthetics of it. So the first one I did was actually the 4MS pingable envelope generator. And I had one, and I was thinking about. I realized the panel was totally symmetrical, so you could flip it over, and I could get someone to silkscreen my own custom graphics on the back. And this was just an afternoon project I was going to do, right? Like just to customize something for myself. So of course, when I got it done, I repaneled it, posted it up on Muffwiggler, and was immediately inundated with requests from people wanting to buy one.
Right.
I was like, well, hey, I could make 20 of these and pay for the cost of the module. That was how I looked at it for a while. So then, I did that one, and requests started coming in for more and more and more, and it just kind of took on a life of its own. Put up the website and so on, and at this point, I think I've shipped panels to 40 some different countries, and they've been pretty extensively photographed and so on showing up. So that was a good intro to what came next. And for me, the story is of creatively is really one of bootstrapping. It's got to do with building something in one area, learning something from it, and then kind of turning around and applying it to a different discipline. And before I got into music tech stuff, I was working in mostly doing software UI design. I did photography as well. I have a master's in architecture. And to me, all that stuff was really kind of a common pursuit towards a similar vague goal, you know?
Mm-hmm.
There's always been feedback loops between all these different disciplines.
Right.
So one day, I remember specifically taking a make noise OptoMix apart. You know, it's a pretty simple module. I'm looking at the board with no panel on it and thinking like, hey, I could make a module. So that was the moment, the epiphany moment that led to making modules for making panels for some time. So the first release was called Algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just a trigger sequencer that once again was like, well, you know, I'll make 20 of these, or, you know, and just it's just something cool that I want to make. And I think that's a common thread in the Eurorack world. Largely, people just want to make something for themselves, right?
Right.
They just want it. They just want it to exist.
Right.
And the fact that the cost of producing electronics has come down so massively in the past 10 years or so, with contract manufacturing and suppliers of all these parts readily available, you know, it's not like it was like back in, let's say, the MOTM days of the late 90s, early 2000s when Paul Schreiber was getting it all together. And you had to have a very deep EE background to get into that. So these days it's quite different. So I've, you know, developed a few Eurorack modules at that point, and that's kind of where we are today with Grayscale.
Right. So the algorithm is a trigger sequencer. What other modules do you have in your rack world?
So two other modules that I developed fairly early on. One was called Binary, and it was
Right.
kind of not an expander exactly, but a companion to algorithm where you could take the individual pulse outs and make a secondary chain of triggers with that. There was another one, again, it was just like one of those things I just wanted to exist. It was called Synapse, and that was a breakout interface for the Electron Analog 4,
Right.
which had CV outputs. And I thought it was just a really great sequencer, and I've always loved the design and depth and intelligence of the Electron boxes, although they can be sometimes so deep that they're frustrating.
Right.
But so I really liked that module and wanted to make a dedicated interface for it. I saw plenty of people online, you know, struggling to find the right cables, and even if you had the right cables, it was kind of a clunky, awkward solution to it,
Mm-hmm.
using all these Y splitters and so on. So both of those, you know, did pretty well. They're currently discontinued. The Synapse was made redundant by the fact that the new Analog 4 has 4 dedicated CV jacks on the back.
Right.
And I think I sold the very last one to a dealer like 2 weeks before the new version came out, so that was good timing. Because the name of the game, the difficulty of, you know, making module hardware is that you have to carry inventory and you have cash coming in, and, you know, there's always cash going out too. So it's a fine line to walk,
Right.
especially if you're just a single operator like I am, you know, working with contract engineers and manufacturers. But so it is kind of incredible in a way that the Eurorack exists in the state that it does. And again, I think it goes back to that low cost tech, you know, wave of the past decade or so. But it, you know, it's still a business. You have to manage all your incoming and outgoing. So I took a bit of a break, got my first day job ever for a while, trying to save up money and make a big move out from Colorado. And got back into making Eurorack stuff a couple years ago. One that I had been working on for quite a while was called Permutation. And that was basically an adaptation of the Turing Machine by Tom Whitwell, the music thing modular. Have you had done a talk with him? I believe you have.
Yeah, I did. Yes.
Yeah, I thought I remembered that one. So yeah, I had that idea for quite a while, and it went through many, many rounds of prototyping and became a bit of a nightmare project, honestly. But it was rebooted, resolved, and from that, the original idea to just do one 18 HP version, the new solution allowed it to be miniaturized into 12 and 6 HP versions as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I took the voltages expander of the Turing machine and also kind of miniaturized that. And with the permutation, I was basically adding, again, just the features that I wanted, you know, that I saw. Coming at things from the design background rather than an engineering background lets me look at it from the user perspective a lot and think about, you know, what's missing from this and what needs to be added. There's a famous, probably apocryphal saying from Don Buchla saying you got to start with the front panel design first,
Right.
not with the circuit.
Right.
and you can see, largely in the Eurorack world, you can see a lot of the results of starting with the circuit first and then thinking, well, I guess I should put the knobs on the panel now, and then everything's too close together, or it just doesn't quite fit right. So a lot of people don't actually care about that, and that's totally fine. But I did find, like with the alternate panels, for example, that a lot of the people that were buying them were designers or architects or scientists, and I thought that was interesting. There were people that appreciated the thought.
Right.
Concurrent to the Permutation being released, I also started working on an adaptation of Clouds by Mutable Instruments, which had been discontinued, I think, in October 2017. And I had been already working on a booklet format version of that, and that was going okay, but I just had an idea to make a Eurorack version too that even was more expanded than my expanded booklet version.
Mm-hmm.
So, so the booklet version kind of got put on hold for a while. Well, that got developed, and like Permutation, I was with the Supercell, which is my Clouds adaptation. I was just basically looking at it, and the reason I think that it was discontinued by Mutable was partially because of frustrations with the way that it was designed and conceived. There were many parameters that were not really accessible. There were lots of button presses required. And so just as a design experiment, one day I was just like, I'm going to lay this out and see what the UI would look like if all this stuff was exposed and how big it was going to be. And it ended up being, quite big. It's just 2 HP shy of being twice the width of Cloud. But, that module has been very well received. And I think the people that are, engaged in this kind of, I want to cram everything possible into a small case, weren't so happy about it because they wanted the functionality, but they couldn't justify the real estate. But for those that can justify the real estate, I think they understand why you would need it to be that big.
Well, as you well know, I own a Supercell, and I actually have it in a 104 HP skiff, and I don't care that it takes up a third of it because, in a way, it changes. So I've had Clouds since the Clouds first came out, and I've always loved it. But I've had a Clouds. I have right now one of the Michigan ThynthWorks Clouds wedged into 8 HP, and I have a Supercell. And the way that I approach each one is completely different. The original Clouds, because I got to know what I do, right? The microburst, I really treat that like a preset machine. It's so tweaky to have to frickin' deal with that I have a setup that it does, and that's what it does, and it is, in essence, a preset module, right?
Mm-hmm.
The complete opposite is the case with the Supercell. What I actually feel like is I'm sitting at almost like a mixing console that happens to be controlling a Clouds. It's something, it's a completely different interaction with the algorithm, and one that I find completely engrossing. And so where often with the original Clouds, or especially the microburst, it's a small portion of a big patch. What I'm finding, a great combination for me has been the 1010 bitbox and the sample cell, because I can use the bitbox as like burp out cool little noises, and then just sit with all the controls of the Clouds and just really dive into the depth of the sound. It's been a completely transforming feeling, and it's all because of UI design.
Yeah, exactly. And I like to use you compared it to a mixing console, because I've actually thought the phrase granular console is a good description of what the module's doing.
Right.
Yeah, and that really just shows, because the code was, from Clouds was changed for Supercell, but the DSP is identical, right? We changed very little of that. All the code was going on, changing the way the presets are stored,
right,
and changing UI glue sort of stuff. But yeah, it's totally accurate if you think about the fact that you've got the same exact code. I mean, that code could be running in a guitar pedal, right?
Right.
That could have one switch on it. Turn it on, and it's like the reverb is halfway, and it's kind of randomly granulating.
Yeah.
But then and then you have a U-burst, which is basically the identical functions to Clouds,
right,
but just smaller. So you've inherited some of the same kind of UI frustrations from that. And then you get Supercell, and you're like, yeah, it just shows the difference that design thinking makes, I guess. And you can really apply that in all kinds of ways. It doesn't, that phrase design thinking is a term that's in common use at this time.
Right. Right.
About all kinds of things, not just synth modules, but there's this. I remember some publication, maybe Fast Company or someone did some research showing how design-driven companies, like software startup companies, had far outperformed the stock market compared to the more laggard companies. So it's good to hear that feedback, honestly, because that is really the motivation. Like I said, I just sat down and sketched it out and was like, what's the ideal version of this look like?
Right.
And in the real world, you just have this the pejorative term value engineering. You've engineered all the value out,
Sure.
and made like the corner cutting version. And if it's your rack, and your rack modular gear in a way is already sort of a luxury. So if you're gonna go maximal with modular, you might as well really go all the way. So
Sure. Well, and it's interesting because a number of other people. I think of my interview with Ben Hintz from Dwarfcraft. Similar thing when I talked to him about the process he goes through in designing a module. Designing the electronics is almost the last thing that he does, unless he has a hint that there's going to be, the requirement for specific parts that might have weird behavior or whatever. He literally starts, he obsesses over the front panels because he wants to make the thing that's going to work the way he wants it to work, before he worries about getting the electronics to do the thing that he wants to do. And I think it's a fabulous way to approach the effort.
yeah, it definitely, to go back to that booklet quote about starting with the panel first, because I think a lot of engineers, and I'm probably succumbing to a stereotype, but they have a bit of an empathy gap when it comes to who's actually going to use the stuff.
Right.
Think about your car or something that, again, that isn't a synth. There's all the manufactured stuff in the world that is just frustrating to use, either because it was designed by committee or because it was designed to fit into a $75 price range,
Right.
or simply because the engineers weren't aware that other people are going to have to use the stuff that you make, and that the stuff that you make is going to be out there in the world living a life of its own, where it's, every day being stress tested by the general public. And it's just a question of like, do you want to make people frustrated, or do you want to make them happy?
Right. Yeah.
And if you want to make them happy, you should start by thinking about it from their perspective, not from your perspective.
Now, it's interesting when you started talking about the modules that you made, that also again made me sort of like gave me a visual blast, because one of the things that you are also involved in is the VCV rack virtual modular system. And you mentioned as a designer, but I know that that those module designs have actually made it to VCV rack as available modules, right?
Yeah, we do have algorithm and binary as rack plugins.
Right.
We're working on the more current releases. As you probably know, Andrew Belt from VCV he's kind of working solely on the platform at this point, to get all the features that he wants in version 1.0, which I think the release is actually imminent. So very soon we're going to start kind of catching up on not only on porting Permutation and Supercell to VCV rack, but the flood of other plugin ideas that we've both had in the past 6 to 9 months or so, and have kind of said we've got to wait on these.
You were one of the first people to work with Andrew on the system, right?
Yeah, he contacted me, I believe, in November 2016 or so, maybe a little earlier than that. And he liked my alt panel designs.
Okay.
Because rather than, I think one of the reasons that I was able to communicate my ideas for the alternate panel thing was that I spent a lot of time making nice, clean-looking renderings of each panel, right? And on the site, I use this nice roll-over thing where you could kind of visualize it with the hardware and without. So he had initially contacted me wanting to kind of license all the graphics that I had created for all the different Eurorack hardware that's out there. Because, everyone's using a few different jacks, there's all these different knobs, and going through and recreating all that stuff would be kind of a pain. I mean, you have to measure things down to the millimeter.
Right.
And so I was like, well, I don't really even know how to license this. It's just what I created for my needs. I was like, but if you want to work together, then why don't we just work together? And because I've been wanting to do more, music-focused UI design work as well, coming from a background of doing like web and desktop and iOS apps, but not really doing anything in the music world. So that was an interest of mine. So that was, he sent me a few just very basic rectangles and dots kind of panel designs
Okay.
with, I think, like a Microsoft Word default font as the typeface, and was like, here's what I have, and I really love when people come to me in that state, because then I just get to, like, it's like repainting your apartment brand new.
Right.
You get
Right.
to kind of start over. And so those were the very first modules in the fundamental plugin, which, is like the most, that's what comes with your default installation of VCV Rack when you download a binary.
Mm-hmm.
And so we worked from there and gave it, a specific kind of aesthetic. We could have gone with this kind of a skeuomorphic looking, realism looking UI design. Not only do I think that stuff makes everything instantly look dated, like it's the 1990s, like Prophet 5 plugin.
Right.
Not only that, but it also, I think, that makes it look intimidating to people. And my background is doing the, non-music focused UI work led me to want it to look non-intimidating, because modular is intimidating enough for people that are new to it. Once you learn it, it's extremely simple.
You mean
But
intimidating for people who wanted to use it, or people
yeah,
who
I
wanted to
think
make modules?
people who wanted to use the
Got it.
software,
Okay.
right,
Right.
coming into it, because I think, I have no hard data for the number, but I'd estimate the user base of Eurorack is around 50,000 people
Mm-hmm.
worldwide, and the user base for music software worldwide is probably 10 times that. 500,000 people, maybe more. I have no idea. You probably have a better statistic on that
Yeah,
than
I
me.
think you could probably do it times 10 of that.
Yeah, okay. So that's a vastly increased user base,
Mm-hmm.
many of whom have literally no familiarity with what an oscillator is, what a VCA is.
So true. Right.
So how do you make it approachable, right?
Right.
So that people can actually use it. Again, this goes back to what I said before about, you're not making it for yourself, you're making it for the people that use it.
Right.
And obviously every designer has personal taste, that you want to impose your taste upon your audience. So there's a tension there, right? Every artist, every designer experiences that tension. You have to find an audience, and you find an audience by making what you want ultimately, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think a lot of people, actually, most people probably appreciated the aesthetic. We did get feedback from people like, I want like shiny panel like backgrounds, like shadows, and you know, and we were like, it's not that we couldn't have designed it to look
Right.
like that. We
Right.
deliberately chose not to design it like that because we wanted it to be approachable.
Sure.
So we worked on the fundamental modules, and we have to keep the project going. So we did start releasing commercial modules, and those kind of let us explore some much more complex ideas. We've recently, I'm going to pull up the website because we've done quite a bit now. So the first release was actually Pulse Matrix, which was just like an algorithm on steroids, basically. Just 8 columns of, or 16 columns of sequencing for triggers, because kind of you want to make that awesome modular drum machine sound that you hear on all the cool Instagram feeds. So trigger sequencing is kind of a core concept for me. There are so many sound sources that are so similar that it becomes kind of chasing the dragon, trying to find that oscillator with the perfect tone. But to me, the compelling thing is really, along with the user interface, it's the sequencing and control and modulation. I think that is underrated, especially for people that are starting. They're looking for that killer oscillator that's going to make the cool sound, but the cool sound comes from all the invisible voltage that's happening, right? So that's kind of why we started with a sequencer. Then we needed a big mixer, so we added VCV console, and did several other modules, including Scalar, which is a very arbitrary quantizer. That was extremely difficult to develop because it was so flexible, but in the end, I think it's a really good design. And we also did Spectra, which is based on the Buchla 296 spectral processor hardware. Yeah, we measured the frequency responses from the hardware and modeled it in. So yeah, that's where we are with Rack. I think as soon as 1.0 is released, we have a lot more plugin concepts that are going to be coming out. So
that's fantastic. From your perspective, what is the difference in challenge of working with software versus hardware? I mean, is there one that you prefer?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, is there one that you prefer? and what are the unique challenges, I guess?
Well, it is the nice thing about rack is that it's one-to-one scaled with your rack modules. And when Andrew first came to me, I was like, you could do anything with software. Like, do you really want to make it look like a module? And I think in the end, though, his intuition about that was a very good one, because it creates this interface metaphor that requires almost no learning from the interface perspective. What you're actually learning is how modular stuff works.
Mm-hmm.
So you're actually, the learning curve of the interface is virtually zero. You have to learn a couple of keyboard shortcuts and so on, but you can open up Rack and follow a simple tutorial and you're making sound very quickly compared to some other software that is out there, and I won't name names, but it takes quite a bit more time to get up to speed. The challenges, I think, it's obviously the inverse of one is kind of like the pro of one is the con of the other, and vice versa. Because with hardware, the development cost is tremendous. If you screw up, then it's going to be a big problem. You're going to have modules out in the field that aren't working properly, people talking crap on Muffwiggler. So you've got to get it right. Whereas with the software, it's extremely fast to lay it out. Andrew does, all the coding and development work. So from my perspective, it's just like, well, I want a knob here, so there's going to be a knob there because I know that Andrew will code it. But at the same time, with software, you can really do anything. Like there's no constraint, right? So you kind of, whereas hardware imposes constraints, software kind of, alleviates them to a certain degree.
Mm-hmm.
I think with hardware too, the reason, that hardware has become popular again is that people really want that tactile interface. And I think one of the reasons Rack has become so successful is, again, because it has that UI metaphor of being a real physical modular. Yeah, it is funny to have a foot in both camps, right? And I'm working on hardware simultaneously, often, in the same day as I'm working on the virtual modular. So it is very interesting to me to bounce back and forth between those two. And I like, again, that sort of feedback loop that the tension between those two things creates, because it rapidly increases my ability to learn from what I'm doing and bootstrap into the next thing.
To me, one of the big differences between software and hardware is that hardware provides you the opportunity to get some physical memory or muscle memory behind how you operate, where software often doesn't. But I noticed that in some of the designs, so I recently taught a class where I used VCV Rack.
Oh, great. Yeah, it's been used in a lot of educational environments. So I think that's cool. Yeah. I know, and then that's a big goal of Andrew's as well. He's very happy about that.
That's cool. Well, one of the things I noticed is just some simple things about control placements or jack placements actually leads to sort of a similar sense of muscle memory, to the point where if you use a module that doesn't quite match up with something else, or particularly if you use a module which might have a completely different design aesthetic, it actually becomes a little frustrating, because you go and you drag the cable to where you think it should go, and it's like, oh yeah, that's not it at all.
Yeah.
And so it can be a little weird, and it's interesting to me to think of building an interface in software that is so much like a modular that you began to develop these sort of nearly tactile interactions with it.
Yeah, and again, that goes back to that UI metaphor. Again, that's why I think his hunch was very good about, it's just going to look like a Eurorack module.
Right.
Because your brain, you see it, and even though you're clicking on it with a mouse, there's still a mental space where you're interacting with the physical metaphor.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Unlike if the UI was just like rectangles with lines connecting, right?
Right.
You have there's knobs, and there's one big knob and there's a small knob, and all that stuff just creates, like I said, that metaphor of physicality.
Yeah. Now, you said that you also have been doing Buchla modules under the name 1979. First of all, why 1979?
Well, there's two reasons. One is just that was the year I was born, and in a way I feel like I'm kind of hitting my stride from a design perspective, okay. And it feels like a good place to be in terms of the culmination of all of my, I guess, about 20 years or so of working on design stuff. Mm-hmm. Also, it was kind of the end of the 1970s, and in a way the end of modular hardware. I don't know the exact dates on the 200 series, kind of, because Don was always he would get bored with something as seemingly
Sure.
as quickly as he created it and quickly move on. And he was, he came up with the I think the 400, right, and the 700, and these things were like so powerful and so advanced. He was literally ahead of his time because there's so few of those that exist. The ones that exist are largely non-functional, as far as I
Right.
understand.
Right.
So the whole digital FM synthesis Yamaha thing of the 1980s came off and killed off modular synthesis hardware for like a decade and a half, right? So it's a kind of it's a what if question. What if that would have continued, and what if that 200 series would have continued to become expanded, not only by the man himself, but by other people making things for the format. So
Sure.
it's a little bit of a time travel. It's also just a kind of a direct nod to the nostalgia of not only modular synths themselves, which, there's a kind of an inherent nostalgia built into it, but to the booklet format specifically. And I think, again, that the 100 and 200 series, I think, are the most aesthetically interesting and usable modules that were ever made, I guess. So that's a direct nod to that nostalgia, and not trying to shy away from it.
Sure. Well, what is it that you think makes them so usable? What is peculiar about those modules? Is it the size? Is it the layout? Or is it the use of colors and the way that text is utilized? What do you find that makes them particularly usable?
Well, the size, layout, and colors are all relevant. I do think the 4U size is kind of ideal for a modular panel, just because the size of certain bits of hardware requires a certain spacing and so on. The interesting thing about the Buchla 200, or I guess all Buchla series panels, are that it's almost a golden ratio as well. It's 4.25 by 7 inches, which is just like right at that golden ratio. So aesthetically, you're already kind of being seduced by the proportions of the front panel.
I never thought about that. That's
Yeah, it
amazing.
just occurred to me while I was laying one out. And I was like, this is the freaking golden ratio. And it's also a 19-inch rack divided by 4.
Uh-huh.
But it just so happens that it turned out to be that way. I think also intrinsic to modular, Eurorack probably breaks these rules with these very complex and deep digital modules. But intrinsic to modular gear is a certain sort of willful primitivism
Mm-hmm.
and a return to the basic stuff. I mean, with free software, with VCV Rack, you can literally sit down and do incredibly complex stuff, right? And if you're a music composer and your job is, you're making a living from composing music, then speed matters and keeping the cost low matters. But if you're just a, home user of modular, why are you spending all the money on this? And the reason is because it's fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's got to do with the fact that you're stripping away all the layers of complexity that an Ableton Live creates between you and the music, and you're looking at the most basic fundamental aspects of sound. And the Buchla 200 specifically, I think the 100 by modern standards does look a little too simple. And I'm still very interested in those modules, and it seems to me that people are going to have access to reproductions of the 100 series in the very near future based on some things that I've heard. But the 200 obviously is available in a kind of a cloned format now. The 100, was the kind of the starting point, and then in the 200, he really refined a lot of those ideas and added to them, added voltage control over a lot of the parameters. So you're looking at, in a way, the most simple version of a modular,
Mm-hmm.
and that just makes it really fun to work with. I think you're dealing with very simple, AD or AHD envelopes. There's not a keyboard involved. You're not using an ADSR. There were filters, in the Buchla format. Historically, by the time the 200 came around, you just had a bandpass filter. So yeah, you're just dealing with the basic building blocks, I think, and it's really fun to interact with things at that level. And I have, plenty of Eurorack modules as well that you can like the complexity of one and appreciate the simplicity of the other, and the clarity that the simplicity provides.
Sure, that makes sense. Now, what is it that you're doing in the Buchla space? What are you providing that's different from what is available from the current Buchla and some of the other module makers?
Mm-hmm. Well, compared to Eurorack, which I think there are a couple hundred, manufacturers that have released modules at this point.
Mm-hmm.
and thousands. I don't know the count on modular grid, but I'm sure it's well into the probably 3,000-4,000 modules by now. I'd have to check the exact number. Compared to that, there's virtually nobody making Buchla format modules other than Buchla USA, which is the company that acquired the rights to the 200E now. So the 200E is a really a technically impressive thing. It has preset control over, I believe, almost every single module. But there's still a lot of gaps in the lineup, because to go back to the simplicity of the 200, if you compare the 200 to where your rack is now, there's like this gaping void between the two.
Right.
So my thinking was, what are some things that I'm missing in my 200 series stuff that would just be useful? So the first developments were basically just some more utilitarian models, and then just as several other projects, such as Supercell or even doing algorithms started, they just started as kind of a sketch to see like what would happen if I took like a digital oscillator like mutable braids, for example, which is open source, and into Buchla format. Like would it look good? Would it feel good?
Mm-hmm.
And I did the mock-up. I was like, yeah, that actually works really well. And so then I was like, what if I try another one? And what if I try another one? And the mutable modules are so loved and so well designed, conceptually, and obviously they're open source. So that was a way to really catch the vintage type Buchla approach up to the 21st century, I guess you could say,
Mm-hmm.
and integrate some of those ideas. There's a whole ton of concepts and stuff in the pipeline for 1979. Development is slow; it just has to be. But there's a lot going on with that behind the scenes, and a lot of model ideas that haven't even announced yet. Some are based on the ones that have been announced are largely based on Mutable's work, but there's a lot of other stuff behind the scenes too. So, really looking forward to getting that going. I think the dual algorithmic oscillator, which is basically two braids behind one panel, started shipping about a year and a half ago, I think. And there's been a lot of development work going on, so the adaptations of clouds and rings will be shipping this month, actually.
Awesome. That's great.
And those are the first three in a very long, queue of prototyping that's going on. So,
how do you feel about utilizing this stuff? I mean, there tends to be a lot of hand waving over utilizing the mutable instruments developments now that they've been discontinued by Mutable. There's a lot of concern about if that is that right to do it. Is that taking advantage of the open source work that was done? How do you feel about that? Just for your own work.
Well, I think taking advantage can have a pejorative term.
Yeah,
but I think
right.
that
I know. I'm sorry.
No, that's totally fine, and because I realize that is one interpretation.
Well, there seems to be not good words for that,
Yeah, no, I get it totally. That is a valid interpretation of it, but I do think that the term is that it was actually open sourced so that someone would take advantage of it, right? That's part of the idea of open source. If you just wanted to keep it all to yourself and never use it, then there's not really a good reason to make it open source. I remember the Pitchinette's repo on GitHub, probably from day one, said, or maybe it was actually when people started using the trademarks to make clone modules, which was something that was not wanted.
Right.
But it said, for your 5U adaptation of clouds, just change the name.
Right.
And every time that I've contacted Mutable and said, "Are you okay with this? Do you mind?" The response was, "It's open source. Do whatever you want. You don't have to get permission from me." And I was just like blown away by how generous that was, right?
Well, I think
in terms of the DIY building, there's a lot of gray area there, and where people haven't really respected the request not to use, for example, mutable instruments on the front panel because it creates confusion about the source of the module.
Right.
But doing something like Supercell, where it's obviously, I think that's ultimately that's why things are open source, because it's so people can build on it.
Right. Well, and I think, so now I go back to what I said before, taking advantage. And I think if you use I think that is actually what's great about it, because with Supercell, as an example, for me, and clearly for you because you designed it, for me, you made an optimal version of that, which was only possible because it was open source.
Yeah, right. I mean, imagine if other company X had released clouds, like it would have just
Right,
disappeared.
right,
And maybe, there are other granular modules on the market today that are good and doing their own takes on granular. So the gap would have been filled by capitalism, right?
right.
By sort of like a competition, Darwinian competition between feature set and HP size and so on. But yeah, it was just to me it was worthwhile to do that kind of maximal version of it, and that was just another branch on the tree of clouds, right? The seed that was planted when those source files were posted, probably 5 years ago or so.
Right. Part of their decision is that it provides an opportunity to display a support of the community by saying, even if we choose not to make the clouds and you still love the clouds, that it doesn't have to go away. The community can pick up the effort at that point. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
And
believe
again,
me,
that's like
there's a
that's how it's
couple.
supposed to work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a couple of modular makers that have disappeared, and one of them in particular, a lot of my work was very dependent on the modules that they made. They went away and no longer support the modules, and it's kind of a bite because it's sort of like, if all of a sudden someone said, well, we're not going to make Les Pauls anymore. We're going to instead have these other Gibson guitars, and you'll love them. That's
Oh yeah, you'll love them, of course. They're going to
yeah,
be perfect.
they'll
Yeah,
be
we
perfect
fixed
for
all the
you. They're
problems.
modern. They're modern,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And it's a problem. It's likewise that can happen with modules. So thanks a lot for talking about that, because I've been wanting to ask someone, and I knew that you would have a very thoughtful response. So thanks for having that discussion.
Yeah, hopefully it's thoughtful. And I think if you the whole modular ecosystem, even across formats, is really it's all building on. We're all building this tower, right?
Right, right,
um, I mean, largely, all of the synthesis concepts were invented in the 1970s. Like, there's been very little new since then. Even if you look at, a typical rack on modular grid, it's all very derivative from what came before. So I think people can, you know, maybe take a little less credit for their
right.
creations and acknowledge that it all came from somewhere,
Yeah,
and that true kind of you know greenfield invention is actually incredibly rare.
very.
Not that there hasn't been any of that in the Eurorack, for example, where there's so much interesting digital stuff going on. But you can see that Eurorack is probably it's hitting a point when new ideas, new technological ideas, are not actually what's important. What's important to me is the user interface.
Yep.
And you can see the companies that are succeeding are the ones that are differentiating themselves on that. IntelliGel is one that comes to mind. That's someone that whose work I've always really liked aesthetically, functionally, and has just delivered. Early on, IntelliGel was making models that were a little more, a little more dense functionally, and he was like, we're going to give these things the right spacing, use bigger knobs, um, and I think that certainly did not harm them as a company. I think that attention to detail and design is one of the things that differentiates them as a brand. So there will always be a need for just making the kind of the lowest common denominator stuff. The market is obviously vast and has a lot of people at different levels in it. So, but I think the space that remains to be claimed is really interface design. Kind of as I mentioned before, the sound generation stuff is so well covered that there's almost nowhere to go. You're standing in a room that's full, right, with
Right,
people
right.
largely. But there are probably near infinite ways to control it all. And that's the invisible aspect of it. And it's not just invisible CV, it's also the invisible, unknown aspects of the human psyche that respond to these machines and interact with them. And nobody can fully quantify that yet. So to me, that's the interesting territory that's left to explore.
Well, and it's funny you say that, because I've thought too that there's so many opportunities for not only improvements in the way that control happens, but also in the way that feedback happens. I think one of the things that has received limited attention in the Eurorack world is feedback on what's going on. And it's probably one of the things that makes it difficult for people who try to get into things. It's why when beginners ask me about making a rack, I'm like, well, at the very least, put like an O'Toole's in or something, right? Something that where you can use it, you can get some feedback on what it is that you're doing, so that you can internalize the sense of what's happening, right?
Right. And even with, I mean, I got a Mordex data, I traded a
Hmm.
permutation with the Mordex guys. Really appreciate that from them. But I can show people the waveforms who are non-technical and they still don't have a clue.
Yeah,
So I agree with you. Like, what is really going on? And at some point, you can't dumb it down. That you have to just accept that it's a technical game. You've got to up your skill to play the game. Um, but I do think, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying about BCV Rack, where you making it accessible, right?
right.
Making it approachable, and not kind of like intimidating, hiding the functions behind cryptic labels, and kind of like not publishing a user manual at all.
Right.
That was the punk rock, first first 5 years, let's say, of not of the Dofer wave, but when the
The
first few
same way,
companies came
right.
around, it was like it's like the willful obscurity of punk rock in the 1980s kind of attitude, right? It's like, well, you can't find our zine at your store because you're not shopping at the right store.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And it's been funny to watch some of that change as more and more people come into Eurorack, for example, at very different levels of skill. And then, it does have that feeling, though, of you're like, well, it was a cool scene while it lasted. Now people are like, how do I make dubstep wobble bass
Yeah, right.
with a Eurorack module? It's
Right.
like,
Why
if you
would
can't
you?
make it with any old synth you've got sitting around, then you certainly
Yeah, right.
have a learning curve to make one on a Eurorack module. So it's like, oh, the newbies have arrived and they're destroying my scene feeling, which nobody can really claim that, unless you're Dieter Dofer.
Well, it's funny. It's funny though that you talk about my scene, because the other thing I wanted to, and we're already running out of time. This is killing me, but I'm going to extend our discussion just a little longer. Um,
Sure.
when you and I first got to know each other, we were both in the Boulder, Denver area, and there was a scene developing, right? And we would show up at meetups, and I remember, I remember you playing a lot. You had a fabulous sound. I loved whenever you did a set. But you and I have both embraced something which is an enjoyment of a more isolated life. We both live in very rural settings, near maybe some populations, but definitely not inside of them. And
Right.
but that seems to be it seems to be difficult in a scene-oriented environment, and I would say definitely modular is that. Now I talk to my friends back in Denver, and they're like, "Well, you can barely walk down the street without a modular synth performance hitting you square in the face, right?"
Modular busking.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Why did you decide to sort of like live outside of that scene type environment? And maybe it's because the internet allows you to have a scene. I don't know. I'm curious about your decisions and how it might actually affect your art, because I don't know if living out in, I find it difficult to have opportunities to perform.
Hmm.
And I don't know why you've made the decisions. I know they're always personal, but I'm curious in your case what the decision making process behind that was.
Yeah, I mean, for me, before I even got out of college as an undergrad, which was, I did psychology as an undergrad. So I'd already decided by the end of that I wasn't going to work in the field. But I was just lucky to get my like first client, right? And it was just a remote project, so I could basically live wherever. So it was like this amazing opportunity had opened up. And this is, the mid to late '90s, so you might be on a 56K modem somewhere, but you can still dial up and work. And I guess I was just always attracted to undeveloped places. It just, to me, it's a little more fundamental of an experience to have, rather than living in a city, which is ultimately a sort of a virtual reality, right?
Hmm.
And there are synergies that happen as a result of that virtuality. But I think you're right that the internet has largely it's put us into a sort of a different virtual reality that's truly virtual and doesn't really necessarily have the physical manifestations of a city. For me personally, I think I just need the quiet think straight and to invent, my own sort of realities that can exist. I mean, that's the creativity is kind of the, an intrinsic part of all the design thinking. And if there's a lot around, it's just harder to concentrate. So in terms of performing, yeah, I appreciate you coming to shows and so on. I haven't performed much at all since moving out of Colorado. I think I kind of got it out of my system and realized that my interest in all of that is largely really focused on the design aspect of it rather than being a, performing musician or something. So, but it was fun to be part of all that for a while.
Interesting. Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, this talk has been great, and it gives me again an appreciation of sort of like the thoughtfulness and the depth that you have in your approach to all the things that you do. I've always appreciated that, but this is a great reminder. I have to say that you are a person that's maybe more focused on creativity than most that I meet. So I'm very appreciative of that. And if it takes being out in the sticks to do it, rock on, man. I think it's a great idea. So
Yeah, I think of it as kind of like listening to the background noise of the universe.
Right.
Like what was here before humans and what will probably, hopefully, persist after us. And that's ultimately the source of all this stuff that humans make. So I think if your thinking is obscured by the kind of the virtual reality of culture, really, which is all kind of it's fun to create, but it's ultimately kind of artificial, right? Ultimately, so yeah, it's good to take a break every once in a while, go out in the woods, take your modular or not. Definitely leave your phone at home and just go back and reconnect with the sources that sort of give us all of the sensory abilities that we have to appreciate things like modular synthesizers.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, with that, I am going to let you have the rest of your day. Thank you so much for spending the time talking and getting caught up, but just also opening up on a lot of this stuff. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks. I appreciate being invited to this as well.
All right. Talk to you later then.
Yep. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks to Wes for the great chat. It's really good to catch up with him again after being away from me for a few years. Remember, if you're interested in the stuff that he does, check out grayscale.info for all the stuff that he does with modulars, and you can always check out VCV Rack to see his designs at work. Thank you so much for continuing to listen, and I will catch you next time around. Bye.